Hello, and welcome to my guide for interviewing with McGill Medicine. My name is Yusing Gu. I'm a first year medical student here at the McGill Faculty of Medicine, and I just finished my interview process last year in February of 2016, so the experience is still very much fresh on my mind too. In this guide, I'll try my best to walk you through sort of the format of the McGill medical interviews, as well as my experiences on interview day, a sample question or two about the kind of questions that you might experience during the interview, and also some tips and tricks about how to prepare for the McGill interview, as well as what to do on interview day itself. Right, so to begin, the McGill medical interviews are very much an MMI format. So in case you're not very familiar with the MMI format, it's very different from sort of the traditional panel interviews where you sit down with a group of 3 to 4 mix of students, faculty, and maybe community members as well, and they interview you directly for about half an hour and just talking and discussing with you with your file. The MMI is a very different format. It's sorted into multiple stations where you're asked to either talk with an assessor within the room, act out a scenario, or do a task based on what they require you to do before you enter the room. So McGill very much adopts this MMI format, and in fact the McGill MMI is called the McGill Multiple Mini Interviews, or the M3I. So on interview day, you'll either be sorted into the morning or the afternoon cohort, and within each cohort you'll also be divided into 2 groups. You'll either get to do your MMI first and then get debriefed afterwards, or you'll get debriefing first while you're waiting for that first group to go, and then you get to do your MMI after. The MMI interview itself is approximately 2 hours long. So McGill does 10 stations for the full MMI, with approximately 9 minutes per station that you can do to conduct your interview. So these 9 minutes are divided into the first 2 minutes being given to read about the prompt that will be outside the door before you enter the station room. And you get these first 2 minutes to read about the prompt and also think about what you might want to say or what you might want to do. The next 7 minutes will be given for completing the task or completing the scenario, or entering the room and completing whatever scenario or task that was described by the prompt. In the middle of these 10 stations, there will be two or three rest stations mixed in as well, and they should be evenly spaced so that they'll give you a chance to take a break, have a drink of water, maybe use the washroom if you need to, and just to refresh before you start the next section again. So the really nice thing about the McGill medical interviews is it's conducted at the Steinberg Center for Simulation and Interactive Learning. It's a very unique facility, and it's a very high-tech, well-designed facility that's specifically designed to let medical students and a lot of other people use for training purposes as well. As a result, they have a very realistic, very state-of-the-art simulated patient and clinic rooms, and all of the clinic rooms are equipped with one-way mirrors, microphones, and also cameras too. As well, all of the actors that you'll encounter throughout the interview, especially for scenarios where you're required to act, all of these actors are very professional. They're paid actors, and they make it seem like it's a very realistic scenario too. As a result of having this space available, and this is a very space that they're very proud of, a lot of stations will likely be acting scenarios because they want to take advantage of the actors there. They also want to be able to take advantage of the space and to be able to observe you in that environment, in that simulated realistic clinic environment. Alright, so in general, there are 3 basic formats as to the kind of questions that you can encounter during the interview. The first is a very typical discussion-based format, and this is usually with an evaluator present. In this kind of station, you would enter the room, and then you can talk about a few things. One of which is your curriculum vitae, or your personal narrative review that you would have had to submit for as part of your McGill Medicine application. Okay, so in this kind of format, they can pick apart, or they can sort of pick out one item or multiple items that they like to talk about and ask you to discuss it more in depth. For example, they can ask you to elaborate on one of the essays that you wrote in your CVPN, and ask you what you learned from it, or what challenges that arose from that specific event, and how you think the lessons that you learned there can apply to a future journey in medicine. Another common question that they could potentially ask in this kind of format is to give you a quote on the outside of the station before you enter the room, and ask you to interpret that quote to the evaluator inside. Finally, another potential question could be to ask you to discuss an ethical scenario which is described in the prompt outside. And when you go inside, you'll be asked to evaluate or to elaborate on your ethical dilemma and basically present your opinion, supporting arguments, defend against any counterpoint or questions that the evaluators may have for you. And this will all be done in sort of a typical sort of third-person observational method. Second station format is sort of a task-oriented format, and this can be done with or without an evaluator present. So this kind of task-oriented format really tests sort of your logic, reasoning, and ability to explain things well. So the task here can actually have quite a variety and quite a range of diversity as well. So tasks here that they can give you can actually include things like physics or math equations, problem-solving scenarios. They can give you a diagram and ask you to interpret it. They can also ask you to give you a prompt and ask you to write an essay about what you think about this prompt too. In this kind of scenario, it's very interesting because I think the correct answer isn't always necessarily needed. They don't always assume that you know what they're asking about. Like for example, if they give you a math equation, if they give you a physics equation or a problem-solving scenario, you may not necessarily need to get the correct answer. But what you really need to do is to be able to explain how you got to your answer, your reasoning, the reasoning behind how you got to the answer, and why you think that answer is right. And in the case that if you are wrong or if you make a false assumption, I think you also should be able to acknowledge it, acknowledge the correction made by the evaluator, and then also sort of modify your answer based on that while the evaluator is asking you. In this kind of scenario, if there's an evaluator present, you will usually get half of that 7 minutes that you have to work on a task. You get the first half for working on the answer yourself, and then for the second half of that 7 minutes, the evaluator will come in and discuss your answer with you and how you got to that, and how you got to the answer that you're giving the evaluator. Right, so the final station format that they can give you, and I think this is a favorite of theirs, is the controlled scenarios or the simulations that are usually done in the very realistic simulated patient rooms. So in this situation, and I think this is unique for McGill, because they have such realistic patient rooms with the one-way mirrors, you won't usually see the evaluator. The evaluator instead will be standing behind the one-way mirror that's present. So as a result, it will be yourself entering a room with the simulated patient or patients, and you'll get to interact with them without sort of having an evaluator in the room looking on. I think this is actually a really good thing because although it does seem like someone's watching from above or from outside, it does really allow for more realistic scenario building, and it really allows for unimpeded acting, in my opinion, because you don't have that evaluator sitting at the back of the rooms watching you. Instead, you have the whole room to yourself, and you can really try to embody sort of the situation and the environment that you're in. So in this kind of controlled scenario or simulation, it really requires a lot of acting and a lot of potential improvisation as well. The situations in this kind of simulation can range widely. It can range from sort of medically oriented situation, non-medically oriented situations, like if you're just talking with a friend or with a neighbor, sort of ethical dilemmas where you have to solve or you have to discuss sort of an ethical problem, very similar to what you might have done in a discussion case, but in this case you're actually acting it out with someone who has an opposing view. Also decision making and other sort of situations where you can really act it out with a fellow, or in this case an actor. Right. So in this kind of scenario, you'll be assuming a role and you'll be interacting directly with whoever is stated on your prompt. Right. So for example, on the prompt, it could be told that you're a student group president, and you'll be interacting with a faculty member that had an issue with the running of a previous club event. right? The problem with these kinds of scenarios is that the prompts can also often be very vague or uninformative. So in this situation, try not to be taken off your guard, and really do your best to improvise depending on the situation. Right? The important thing is, and I think something that they really want to look for is how you react to unexpected situations. So if something doesn't meet your expectation, or it goes off a completely different path, don't be taken off guard by that, and go along with sort of how the story is unfolding, because they want to see how you can react to that change too. Right, so in terms of my experience on interview day, I actually thought it was a lot of fun. It was definitely the most fun interview that I went to over my application process. And I think part of that reason is because there was such a heavy emphasis on sort of acting in a simulation. It's really one thing to sort of practice and discuss what you would do in a certain ethical dilemma, but it's another thing entirely to act it out with someone who has that opposing view, who assumes that role of an opponent, and that kind of scenario really allows you to demonstrate your ability to react in that real life situation. How would you react if you were actually thrust in that situation, instead of just talking about it and talking about what you would do? This is really a chance for you to get to show what you would do in that situation, and sometimes that can be very intimidating. But with a lot of practice, I think it really allows you to be yourself a lot more and see how you react, and how well you can cope in that kind of situation. Especially for the acting scenarios, they are very realistic. So really try to embody the role that you're given, and try to act how you would really react if you were in that environment in real life, outside of the interview scenario. I think what I really found was nice about the MMIs in general was the ability to sort of reset after every station, right? So every station has a different assessor, different evaluator. So you can have one or even a few stations that don't go as well as you'd like, but as long as you keep in mind that the rest of the stations will have different assessors and different evaluators, and completely different evaluators as well. Um, you can definitely have a good overall interview while having a few bad stations here and there. And as long as you try not to let that one bad station affect you for the rest of your interviews, you can really have a very strong interview, a very strong overall interview. I think what I also really liked about the McGill Medicine interviews is it's very diverse in the kind of tasks and the topics it asks. Unlike a lot of sort of the traditional interviews in maybe perhaps other schools, where they focus on sort of ethics, and then focus on your personal narrative. There's really a wide range of things that they're looking for in a McGill interview, and I think the acting scenarios, the task oriented, and also the discussion based format really addresses that really well. I think because of such a diversity, the McGill interview really assesses your ability to sort of problem solve and adapt quickly, and really be able to react to changing situations and unexpected scenarios. And so that can be intimidating, but if you get a lot of practice in on very diverse kinds of scenarios, then I think it will be a big benefit to you, and you won't be taken off guard when you get to the interview. So here's a few sample questions that I think could be very similar to the things that you might experience on the interview. So one thing that I mentioned earlier was that there's a very heavy emphasis on acting. So you might have encountered ethical scenarios where you had to discuss sort of what the ethical problem is and what you would do. So the acting scenarios actually takes those kinds of ethical dilemmas, and then get you to act it out with someone who may be on the receiving end of your decisions. So for example, a potential similar question you might experience for the acting scenario is what I've listed here. For example, you have just accidentally run over your elderly neighbor's cat whilst reversing your car. You're now knocking on her door to break the bad news to her. So prompts can often be that short. It can be longer as well, but here you can get a clear idea of who you are, what has happened, and who you'll be talking to. The really, I think, cool but also very interesting thing that you can experience in that is you might not expect, you might not, your expectations might be very different from what you experience when you first enter that room. For example, when you walk into the elderly neighbor's room in this kind of scenario, your neighbor may react in a whole bunch of different ways. For example, they could react. I mean, they may not know anything about the cat, um, and they could be welcoming their favorite neighbor, and they would have some cookies and or some snacks prepared for you, and also say, how nice it is for you to visit when we don't get to see each other often. It could start off with a very misleading or sort of off-topic beginning. And the important thing is not to get taken off guard by that and to stick to what you would do in that kind of scenario. Um, the actor uh, could also be probing quite a bit too. They could be asking you, "Oh, have you seen my cat?" Or um, I've been worried about my cat. He's been lost for the past couple of hours, and I haven't been able to really see him around the house. Can you help me find him? Something like that. It could start off on a very different note compared to what you expect. So it's very important to sort of go in without having really much expectations, but really sticking to what you wanted to say and how you wanted to say it. The really cool thing about the simulation center is, for this kind of scenario, they can actually get sort of an elderly woman to play this role. So that just makes it even more realistic, and hopefully that will be able to help you put you into that mindset and put you into the role that you have to assume, so that it can be a very realistic scenario for you, and you can react accordingly. So that's a potential sample question for an acting scenario. For the task-oriented scenario, there's actually so many things that they could potentially ask you, and some of the things might not be what you expect. For example, the question that I have, for example, here is it's very similar to sort of a math logic question, and I know some of you may not expect or think that something like this would be on the medical interviews, and that's sort of what I thought too when I experienced questions that were some sort of similar to this. But really, if you look at this question, it's not so much of a math question as much of a sort of a logic question. What would you do in this scenario, and how would you explain it to someone who's just coming in and trying to hear what your reasoning is? So in this kind of a situation, you wouldn't just say, "Oh, I think so and so, like A or C. Those aren't the correct answers, but I think that those are right," and not explain why. What they really want you to do is to be able to go through step by step what your reasoning process is. And it's even better if you manage to make some notes or draw a potential flow, like a flow diagram, to explain what you think the relationship of these letters are to each other. And as a result, this is why this and this is true, and why this is not true. So here, again, you may not necessarily need to get the right answer, but but you want to make sure that you have a very solid reasoning as to why you chose the answer that you did. And if in fact the answer is wrong, and they point out something that would make your question wrong, excuse me, to make your question wrong, then you can try to adapt to what they said, and also say, "Oh, so if this is true, or if what you say is true, then this and this actually isn't true." And instead, and if you just think about it there, you can sort of explain to them what is true instead. So I think in that kind of situation, don't be taken off guard if you see questions like this, because what they're really looking for is your logic, your reasoning, your ability to problem solve, and really also to explain your thought process. And I think that's a really important part of being able to convey information both to the examiner as well as to potential patients down the line. Right, so what to expect in, I think, while you're during your interview day, and what to expect while you're in an MMI. So an important thing that I think you should really remember is that every station is a fresh start. It's okay to have bad stations. It's best not to have bad stations, but if you do have a bad station, it's alright, because you have so many other stations that you can make it up with, and every station has different evaluators. So even if you don't do so well on one station, try your best to sort of block it out of your mind, or to encourage yourself to do better on the next station. And this way, you can have an overall very strong interview, even if you have one or two bad stations in there. Especially for the acting scenarios, here, it's very important to be yourself. Don't think too much about how, oh, someone's always watching or someone's in the back of the room. And in fact, I think the McGill Medicine interviews does a really good job of getting rid of that because of their simulated patient rooms. But it's really nice to try to be yourself and imagine what you would really do in that scenario, and then do that, right? Instead of talking about what you would do, actually do it and initiate that action. It's also really important not to assume that they're assessing certain qualities or characteristics. And they actually tell you this right at the beginning. They tell you that, like, don't think or don't assume that they're assessing certain qualities, because in reality we don't really know. We don't really know, and the interviewees never really know what they're evaluating us on. So really just do your best to embody the situation, be as realistic as possible, and really try to imagine yourself in that environment. The actors and I think the realistic patient rooms really help in that regard. So just use those to help fuel sort of that acting scenario. Right. So also some basic common niceties when you're in interview day, while we're going through each station. Make sure you knock at every station to shake hands with whoever you're interacting with, and introduce yourself at every station too. Especially for the acting scenarios, one thing that you do want to do is make sure you introduce yourself not as yourself, the applicant, but as your given role too. Because for the acting scenarios, they start right when you enter the room. They don't wait for you to verify who the applicant is, and they expect you to assume that role when you enter the room. So make sure that you assume that role before you enter the room and introduce yourself as that role. For some of the tasks, actually, it's okay to not fully complete a given task. And some of you may actually get scenarios where they tell you explicitly on the prompt, it's okay to not complete the tasks that they're given. I think in a lot of those scenarios, your thought process, your reasoning, and your ability to explain and follow through is more important. And that's what they're really looking for throughout the assessment process. Right, and also if you finish your task or discussion early, it's okay to remain silent. They're not really there to make small talk, and I don't think it's very appropriate to ask them questions as well. This is definitely even more so in the acting scenarios. And if you finish early in the acting scenarios, it's okay to just remain silent and wait until the bell rings and you can exit the room. Also, always make sure to thank whoever is evaluating you, or whoever the actor is at the end. Just leave a good impression. All right. So finally, it's you do have 10 different stations, and while every station is a fresh start, every station gives you a chance to make a first impression. So make sure that when you enter the room, do everything like I mentioned earlier. Knock, shake hands, introduce yourself, smile, and make sure you make 10 good first impressions. So finally, for preparing for the MMI interviews, uh, the most important thing I think, and not just for MMIs, but for any other kind of interview as well, the most important thing to do is to practice, practice, practice. Right. So do your best to try and practice with friends, family, or anyone that you can really you pull up. Other applicants could work as well, and try your best to practice with them face to face. Skype is pretty good as well if you can't do face to face, but having face to face really allows you to see sort of the whole body, all your nonverbal communication methods, your body language, and I think that's really just as important as well to what you say too. You want to make sure that other people get to observe what not just what you say, but your body language and your tone of voice too, because all of that comes across when you're in the interview too. You also want to get a feel of the timing of the 2 minutes plus the 7 minutes that you're given afterwards. So you make sure you have a good idea of sort of how long you want to stay in the initial statement, or how long you might have to interact with people. You want to make sure that, especially with the session questions, you don't end too early, or you also don't want to make sure that you have a 5 minute or a 6 minute long opening statement when you have just 7 minutes to talk to the evaluator. Right. Something else that you could also do for MMIs is to review all of the ethical dilemma, or to review a lot of ethical dilemmas that you may experience. But answer these ethical dilemmas both in sort of an observational discussion style. So these would be more in sort of the discussion format, where you're talking about what you would do. But also try to review these ethical dilemmas in sort of an interacting acting style with someone else. So in this case, instead of just talking about what you would do, actually acting it out and and taking action, demonstrating what you would do in that scenario. For the sort of task-based scenarios, you want to make sure you practice your problem solving skills, and especially practice explaining your thought process to others, and see if others people can follow you or other people think that you're very clear. Um, that way, that really strengthens your reasoning, but also your ability to explain to other people too. For the discussion-based personal sort of discussion-based questions where they can ask you about yourself, definitely know your CVP and your sort of personal experience as well, and also try to note down as many influential experiences that you've had in the past, or sort of influential positions that you've had in the past that you can really talk about. And that's where if you get a discussion-based question that's centered about your history, that's where you can really shine through and discuss things that really matter to you and really matter to your journey towards medicine. Also, one final thing that would definitely be good to do is just to read up on some current and some of the recent medical news, both in Montreal, sort of Quebec, or in Canada in general, and even the States as well. And just to be up to date with some of the medical occurrences that are happening, some of the big controversial topics nowadays. It'll be good to know a little bit background about these so that you can potentially talk about them in case of any ethical scenario. Right, so finally, I've included some resources that I was using while I was practicing for my MMIs. The first thing, of course, to turn to is Google. There's a lot of practice MMI questions online from multiple sources, so pull as many of these as you can to use for practice. And really, the more of these can go through, the more you'll sort of be experienced to the kind of questions that they can ask, and also be able to see what kind of answers you would give in a certain scenario. For sort of the ethics questions that you can think about, you can look at the CMAJ Medical Ethics articles, which I've linked here, and also the American Medical Association ethics journals too. And I think that's a really good resource to use, which gives you a really clear breakdown of some of the hot topics in medicine nowadays. One extra resource that I really wanted to include was a CBC podcast called White Coat Black Art. And it's really a podcast done by Dr. Brian Goldman, and he's an emergency physician, and he really talks about a lot of the current healthcare issues as well as sort of the culture of medicine, and not really in sort of more of a sort of a student or a public point of view. And it's really a very interesting, very compelling podcast to listen to too. That actually gives a lot of information on sort of the controversies surrounding healthcare today. And I highly recommend that you give that a listen to before you enter the interview. Alright, so that's it for me. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at using94@gmail.com, or you can definitely also email info@mdconsultants.ca, and that's our company. And you can feel free to shoot them an email, and we can potentially set you up with an appointment to further discuss the interview and help you practice for your interview too. But anyways, I wish you the best of luck during your interview. I hope that this guide helped you towards your interview prep, and also for things that you can potentially expect during the interview day. And best of luck. Thank you very much.